Washington's passing game could explode against USC.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's site editor with Athlon Sports Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Lars, we got a really fun show coming at all the everydayers today. We're going to talk about some of the excitement that's building around UW basketball after the big exhibition game win over, D2 school, but there's so much to be excited about with the talent on this team. We're going to get there because we're going to talk about the pass rush and if it can thrive against a USC offensive line that's been pretty solid this season. Not great, but it's been solid. But we got to start with Washington's passing game. This is something that's been under, I don't want to say scrutiny, but, with the offensive line having some trouble, it hasn't been as good as it can be over the last couple of weeks. And against the USC defense that's had some injuries on the back end and ranks 14th in the Big Ten, giving up 234 yards a game through the air. Lars, I feel like it could be a really, really big day for this UW offense.
I mean, what was the get right game last year in a way? Not get right, but it was the USC game where you break Alex Grinch. Alex Grinch no longer there. D'Anton Lynn taking over. We've seen improvements on the USC defense, so it's not a gimme game in that sense. But yeah, I think when you look at the way that especially after Indiana, when you look at some of those interceptions, I think I would hope. I'm going to say hope because, again, with Jedd, I kind of wait to see it. But you would hope that Jedd looks at the Indiana game and says, you know what, let's go back to the 5 yards and under, either behind the line of scrimmage or within 5, a quick slant, maybe an 8-yard curl, and then let him cook. Because this offensive line, with or without USC's pass rush running, just get the ball in space and let the passing attack cook. Because when you complete the underneath stuff, then you suck up the defense and then you get the shots over the top. It's almost like Jedd is kind of trying to go for the shot, run, set up the underneath. It's almost like, the puzzle pieces are all there. Just reverse them a little bit because this passing attack, Will's capable of cooking for 330 against USC. Like I could say 330 and 3 touchdowns against USC with the right play calling, with some good decision making from Will. Because again, it's not just on Jedd. We should kind of be clear about this. There's been a couple mistakes from Will, but really not a ton. But I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying he hasn't missed a throw.
Yeah, you're right, Chris, because no college quarterback is ever going to be that, that perfection level unless you're thinking about like a Joe Burrow, because even Michael Penix had his flaws at times where he'd be too overconfident with his arm strength. But I like where you're going with that. And that's one thing that I'm thinking about because I look at this Washington, just this group of skill players, right? I look at Giles Jackson. I look at Jeremiah Hunter, Denzel Boston, Kaleki Latu, whoever it is you want to point to. And I say, I think that they have a big advantage over a lot of guys in this USC secondary, healthy or not. Where healthy, they've been solid, but I look at this Washington passing attack and I say, I look at, a guy like Giles where you give him the ball behind the line of scrimmage against Michigan and he's shaking defenders and taking it for 10, 15 yards. So I really like where you're going with that because that was the first thing that popped into my head when you said that was, just thinking about Giles getting the ball in space, it's been a recipe for success for this offense this season. The one thing that I'm really glad you brought up, Lars, is getting the ball out quick is great, but the right play calling. Because, getting the ball out quick and throwing, quick outs and slants and whatever else is great. But you got to make sure that on, third medium that you run your routes past the sticks. That's one thing that I really want to see in this game.
Well, and, I'm looking at the stats from the USC Rutgers game. Again, it's the last game USC played, so I'm not going back to the LSU game. Just kind of recency, not bias, but recency relevancy more than anything else. The one thing that I'm kind of seeing a lot of that Washington really needs to do, spread out targets one. So you're talking, the targets it was 20 targets with 11 catches for Rutgers leading receiver Miller, which was shocking in its own right. But the number that looks to me is the yak yards after catch. Where did we see Denzel thrive against Rutgers? It was the slant that he took 50 yards to the house. It wasn't a 40-yard deep shot in the air, 10 yards from the 10 into the end zone. Where Washington thrives is, as you said, Giles, ball in space. Jonah Coleman, Cam Davis, Adam Muhammad, check downs over the middle, underneath in the flat. And how many, I think, you know what's funny? Michael Penix and Will Rogers have one thing in common.
What's that?
When they came to Washington, they completely lost sight of the check down outside in the flat. The amount of times that Jonah has been open in the flat, that 4th and 3, I truly thought Will was going to throw it to Jonah before he decided to elect to run for it and not get it, because Jonah was wide open in the flat. Now, again, yeah, the pocket collapsed up the middle, so I understand his eyesight's going to be up the middle. But it was the same thing with Mike, where it's like, look, you're so focused on seeing down the field, look to the side. You know what the play is. You know there's going to be a guy possibly out there. All you got to do is peek. Hey, is Jonah? Oh, Jonah's covered by 3 guys. Nope, run straight.
Sure.
Oh, Jonah's open. Because here's the thing. In that same game against Indiana, Will threw on that penalty like 2.5 yards after the line of scrimmage. So it's not like, Will's oblivious to that. So to me, it's just a matter of seeing the entire field and using the yak versus locking into Denzel or locking into Jeremiah before the snap. I think that's kind of been Will's Achilles heel, is it seems like Will's like, look, no matter what the play is, I'm going to Denzel on this, or, holding it until Denzel gets open. And that's where we've seen some of the sacks or some of the mistakes come into play where Will is trying to force it. But that's where you pair it with the play calling. Jedd needs to help Will as much as Will needs to help Jedd. And the problem is, in a way, and I don't think they're ever going to admit this, Will is the stepchild, Diomande is the kid. You see where I'm going with this?
Well, because it's something that it's the same thing that I talked about earlier in the week, right? Where it's the offense has been moved around to kind of it hasn't been fully moved around to cater to what Will's skill set completely is. So I see where you're going with that, but the more I look at this offense, I think it's just the offensive line certainly is hamstrung things at times. Where I look at the passing attack and I say, yeah, Will doesn't have the time in order to take the deep shots with some of the routes that, especially that we saw against Indiana. But there are so many other little things in this offense where it's, all right, it feels like there's a combination of things at play here that are keeping it, honestly, the best way to say it is just keeping them out of the end zone, because it's not that they're not picking up yards. That's happening, but they're not scoring enough points. It's, silly to go the whole Booger McFarland route of, if you score more points, you're probably going to win the game. But that's really what this whole thing has been. And when I look at this USC game, I see an opportunity to really get right in that sense, not just in terms of scoring, but being able to do it through the air, where it just feels like, especially in these last 2 games, we've seen a lack of explosive plays through the air. And that's something that this offense needs to do well and has the pieces and ability to do really, really well, but we just haven't seen it.
It's really interesting. What have we also not seen? Consistently 3 receivers having an equal number of targets, or let's say north of 5. It's always, Denzel gets 7, 8, 9, and then Jeremiah somewhere at 3 or 4, and then Giles maybe checks in with a couple. It's like there never seems to be a truly 3 receiver, like, I'm not saying you have to have 300-yard receivers, but right. Okay, look at the Maryland USC game, where Maryland beats USC on the at home in Maryland in College Park. Todd Felton did not lead Maryland in yards that day. Worth noting that. So it's like you can still have production from some of your receivers, but you really have to spread it out. And one thing we haven't seen consistently from Jedd or this offense at Washington is getting both Jeremiah, Denzel, and who am I missing here? Giles.
Yeah, Giles. I was going to say it could be Giles or Kalecki or whoever else. Yeah.
But there's never been a true third. And sure. I think that's a fair criticism of Jedd to say, you have the horses. You literally made sure Jeremiah stayed. I know the offensive line isn't great, but there's something missing. Again, we've touched on it the past week and a half, where it's like, it's not friction. It's not, 6 to 1, half a dozen the other. But we talked about, forcing the offense into tailor-making the offense into Will or Diomande. It's like you're trying to do everything and nothing is happening. Like, right. There's some things are happening in certain teams, but as they've gone throughout the schedule, I mean, you're at a 2-game lose. You're not coming into homecoming with momentum. So it's a matter of find a way to get as many guys. You don't need a 12, 13, 14 target guy. You need, let's say, 4 guys with 7 targets.
Lars, I certainly see where you're going with that, but we got to move on here because another group that we really need to get into today is the pass rush. which we'll get to right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. You can get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. With Thursday Night Football coming up later today, I really like the Texans in this game. Texans money line, the Jets, they're just a disaster. I like that pass rush. I think they're going to get after Aaron Rodgers, and they've got the bodies in the secondary to be able to cover those two receivers, because that's really what the Jets are right now. So, Lars, let's talk about this Washington pass rush. This USC offensive line, it's been pretty solid this season. It hasn't been over the top stellar or elite, anything like that, but it's been really good and good enough to get the job done. And with Miller Moss back there, he's got some solid options. But I look at this pass rush and, with or without Zach Durfee, as we've talked about him, he's dealing with turf toe in both feet. And on top of that, there's so many other bodies. There's Sebastian Valdez. There's Alphonzo Tuputala, who's been stellar this season. Isaiah Ward, Lance Holtzclaw, Jaden Wayne, Tunuufi. There's so many bodies that have been productive pass rushers at points this season that I look at this game in particular with the way USC wants to structure their offense and the way they've won and the way Lincoln Riley likes to coach. And I think this is a game that's perfectly suited for the way that Steve Belichick wants to play defense, because he's got the bodies in the secondary to be able to cover these receivers and stick with them in man. And at the same point, we know that with those bodies, he's comfortable sending a blitzer, sending even two, to try to get some pressure on Miller Moss and force a couple of bad throws. And I feel like that's something that is going to be extra critical this weekend.
Man, I'm looking at the PFF numbers in the pass rush. It is not pretty. I mean, again, that's the thing, is it's like there's so many bodies that UW has been able to throw, but not a ton have actually consistently got home or made a true impact. And I say that respectfully, because it's like, again, it's because of the offenses that they play. When you're looking at more running plays, and that's the issue. And so but that's why I want to clarify. It's like, look, hasn't been pretty. Also, haven't really seen it, both because of injuries and because of opponents and offenses like that. But the guy that I think is the X factor in this whole situation, it's Boy. And I know we said Alphonzo for again, pick an X, okay? Not relationships, but just pick an X, whichever one you want to pick. It's either Alphonzo or Boy. And I think for the same reason, they kind of feed off of each other, because when you're talking about all three levels of a Steve Belichick defense against Miller Moss, your secondary's got to keep contained to make sure you don't get beat over the top. Linebackers kind of got to do a mix of both. Carson's your true inside. So that's why Alphonzo becomes your X. And then Voy is that undersized guy, which really, he's been the most successful pass rusher that UW has had. If you want to take out Jordan Shaw, because Jordan Shaw is the highest graded. I'm not going down that road. But that's the kind of my point here, is that Voy has been the highest graded pass rusher in true pass rush sets for Washington.
Sure. But
it still hasn't been great. There's no Braylon Trice on this team. And that's why I think, it's been a little surprising that they haven't had that second guy emerge. I'm a little surprised Isaiah Ward hasn't come on a little bit more. But then against the offense, and that's what's so frustrating, because we haven't seen it.
Right, because that's something that Jedd talked about a few weeks ago, where he was asked about Isaiah Ward, who had been on a somewhat limited snap count, and he said, "Yeah, it's not a product of him. We really like him, but it was a product of we look at when we're playing Michigan or Iowa, and it's we know they're not going to throw the ball very often. So why are we going to do that when we have somebody else who can fit that a lot better?" Like, we got asked about Jacob Lane a couple of days ago, and it's another thing where there's Jacob Lane and Maurice Himes in the same light, where it's, you look at this defensive line, and one of the reasons we really liked just this group as a whole coming into the season was there were so many bodies that you can see the upside with a lot of these guys. But the question was, what's that going to look like this season? And it's kind of, especially with the way that Iowa was able to do what they did, and Indiana to an extent as well in the second half, where you look at them and you just say, it's not perfectly built for what the Big Ten is just yet. But at the same point, you look at them and you say, if you were able to find a way to stop the run a little bit better, you look at all these bodies and say, we know they all have the ability to get after the quarterback, but they haven't had to do it. And this is the first game of that stretch where you can really say, we know they're going to want to do that early. They're going to want to do it often. They like to throw the ball. So, I mean, if we see a career high in snaps from an Isaiah Ward or a Lance Holtzclaw or some of these other guys that we know are there to be pass rushers. I don't think I'd be surprised if we saw that this week, but what I really want to see, Lars, as you said, is it needs to convert. And it's not just sacks, it's pressures, it's hurries. It's finding ways to force Miller Moss to get rid of the ball before he wants to, because like we talked about with the secondary, I wrote about Thaddeus Dixon a little bit over on Huskies Wire. It's the bodies are there on the back end to make it work. And we thought we were going to see it a little bit more last week against Indiana, but obviously without Curtis Rourke, the game plan was a little bit different. But even with Taven Jackson in the game, they still did a really, really good job. So now when I look at it again this week, it's okay, let's see what these guys are going to be able to do.
Right. And I think, part of the Indiana game goes back to look how many long drives Indiana had where you're milking the possession, you're bleeding the clock. And that's no shot at Indiana. It's just your defense is going to get more exhausted the longer you're on the field. And then if your offense isn't helping out, it just exacerbates the problem. So that's why, all these things that we'll get to on Friday's show about, keys to the game and all that sort of stuff. It's why it all feeds into it where, yes, you're absolutely right. You don't have to get sacks. Like UW doesn't have that many sacks in terms of, they have a lot of guys with 3 or under, but there's no Braylon Trice. There was no Haloi Kikaka. There's no, main grade A, not that Zach Durfee isn't or that Isaiah Ward couldn't be, but just from a production standpoint, we haven't seen that this season. But there's so many guys where it's like there's so much potential. It's just a matter of, can you get it all to work in the same light? Because we've seen sometimes where, hey, we're gonna drop 3 rush A, and then defense kind of gets discombobulated. You give up a touchdown run to John Mateer, those sort of things. So it's okay against Miller Moss, against Lincoln Riley. This matchup, it's Steve Belichick versus Lincoln Riley. Like, think about that. Like, who are you picking in that regard? We would have usually thought Steve Belichick, and it's not that we're not, but it's just like, man, it's kind of hard to wonder what is this going to look like when we haven't truly seen it. And the other key, I think that throughout the season, we both knew and are big fans of Zach Durfee, but I think especially when Jedd said setting the edge, not just as a pass rusher, but setting a true edge. Right. I think like just having that veteran out there to know, like, yeah, you know what, whether he's pass rushing, blitzing a quarterback or defending the run, you haven't had that same level out there. And so I think that, and again, we thought we'd see him at Indiana. Jedd was like, hey, the one guy we know will be back is Zach Durfee. Everybody else, who knows? And who didn't play? Zach Durfee. Now, that wasn't on Jedd because, they honestly, the way it sounded was like, hey, he was good to go up until Saturday, and then something happened Saturday. But if you can get Zach back, that is a massive step.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of what I look at with this, where, the one thing when that kind of clicked for me while you were talking about all that was it goes back farther than, the Iowa or the Indiana games, 2 games that he's missed recently. It goes all the way back to the Rutgers game for me, where we saw him come out, we saw him play really well and defend the run really, really well against Cal Monungai. And then he got pulled because of the injury. So it was one of those things where, then, the run really started to wear down. And obviously the Javon Parker injury happens then as well, which is, because I think when I look at the interior, I've been happy with what Sebastian Valdez has provided, where it's obviously not the production that he had at Montana State, but you weren't expecting that. That's a different level of competition. So, but the fact that he's been able to collapse the pocket a little bit has still been really helpful. And the more I look at it, it's on these edge guys to hit home, and they've done a decent job of it. But when you talk about Lincoln Riley versus Steve Belichick, the thing that I think about with all this is Steve has still developed a really, really good game plan for each matchup this season. When I look at it, I know Washington's still in the top 10 for yards allowed this season. They've still been really, really solid by most metrics in terms of what the defense has been. But you look at the Iowa game, you look at the Indiana game in particular, they just got straight up out physical. And when I think about this USC team and what its identity is, I think Woody Marks is a really fantastic player. We talked to Will Rogers about him the other day, but I don't think he's the kind of guy who's going to come out and, especially with Lincoln Riley, he's not the kind of guy who's going to look at that and say, I'm going to give that guy 30 plus carries. Like, that's just not going to happen. He wants to throw the ball. He likes to throw the ball. And in this game, I trust Steve Belichick more than I do Lincoln Riley, where I look at what Lincoln has been this season, and that hats off to him for that LSU win. That was a spectacular win in week 1. But since then, he hasn't done much for me where I can look at it and I can say, yeah, that's a guy that, no matter who the defensive coordinator is, I'd be concerned about, because we've seen him blow games. We saw him blow a 2-touchdown lead in the 4th quarter at Maryland as you alluded to. Like, we've still seen that. Like, that side of Lincoln Riley is still there. And I think Dan Lynn's a really good defensive coordinator, so I'm curious to see how that battle ends up working out. But when I look at the battle of USC's offense versus Washington's defense and what we've seen from Steve Belichick and the way he's able to counter what offenses want to do, he's done it really, really well every single time. If it's not being like, because Jedd likes to talk about execution on the offensive side, right? Where I think if there's an execution, it's on the defensive side because the pieces aren't all there, especially when you look at the defensive tackles and the injuries and the just guys that have missed games that that position in particular has suffered. That's where the problem has been on defense, in my opinion. It's not because of the scheme. The scheme has done a really good job putting these guys in position. Look at Alphonzo Tuputala. Look at Tunuufi. Look at Thaddeus Dixon. It's all there on the defensive side of the ball. And this could be a week where we look back on it and say, oh yeah, this is why Steve Belichick is one of the, in my opinion, one of the 5 best defensive coordinators in college football. But Lars, it's time to switch gears a little bit because Washington basketball had a scrimmage on Tuesday, or an exhibition, and an exhibition on Tuesday, and there's a lot to be excited about, which we'll get to right after a message from our friends over at 5 Hour Energy, because our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate football fan isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. It takes a lot of energy to power through all-day tailgates, touchdown celebrations, or an agonizing second overtime, which is why they've created the Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot, which is a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like us, the fans who are first in the parking lot and who are last to leave. We see you. You know what else gives me a bit of Husky fan fuel this week? The fact that the Washington Huskies are back at home for the first time in a month. It is so great to see that. Lars and I both missed Husky Stadium, and we are so excited to get back there for a game on Saturday. 5 Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. That's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help keep you fueled throughout the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5 Hour Energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. Lars, Washington basketball, you were at the scrimmage on Tuesday night when they beat Western Oregon. What was it, 105-68 or something like? It was the final score was
dead on. Yeah.
Nice. All right, go me. But as great as that final score is, yeah, it's a Division II team. But when we look at this Washington basketball team, you and I couldn't be more excited about where it's going. Obviously, Great Osobor being at the center of that. He was named to the Naismith Trophy watch list, which is really cool to see. But you look up and down this roster, Lars, there's a lot of talent. And we got to see exactly what Sprinkle Ball is on Tuesday night, and I loved what I saw.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, it was intriguing. Again, I loved the press release before the game when it said that you'd have won 21 straight exhibition games dating back to 2000. And it's like, well, I know Hop had some bad years, and I know Romer had a couple bad years. But yeah, if you ever lost an exhibition game to a D3 school, like, close up shop, start over next season. Just don't even bother playing the season. Just call it a wrap. Because, yeah, there's no reason Washington should have even been in that game. And really, aside from the first, I think, 4 minutes of that game, and it was like 7-5, loosely filling stuff out. But a couple of things that I took away from the game. The starting 5 last night might not be the starting 5 for the rest of the season. Just calling that a spade, because that's what Danny said. It's like, we don't really have a starting 5 right now. We have a couple of guys that obviously Great's going to start. Obviously, DJ James is probably going to start. But, there's a lot of fluidity where Lewis Courtwright, a senior forward/guard, didn't play last night. He's out with a concussion, I believe, is what Danny Sprinkle kind of made it sound like. He said he's in protocol. So I'm assuming one leads to another there on that one. I don't think there's an ankle protocol or an elbow protocol. I mean, there's a personal protocol that I have, but that's different. But, and then you talk about Curtis Conway. I was asked about Chris that Conway, one by Chris Conway. That's on me, because I think I said that during the question last night to Sprinkle. Like, Curtis Conway, I don't know why I keep saying Curtis Conway. I think he's a play-by-play broadcaster. Anyways, Chris Conway is out indefinitely with an injury. I would describe it as a lower body injury until told otherwise. There's no crutches. There's no things like that. There's no arm in a sling that I saw. He didn't participate in Molly Madness last Tuesday either, and did not participate in the secret scrimmage against Boise State. So to me, that's okay. Clearly, he's going to be out probably until December. Who knows? Maybe when you add 2 players back to this roster, we'll see.
Right.
That's a kind of
We'll
hint
get there.
for later. We'll get there eventually, because that we didn't bring up that last night with Danny either. Because again, that's just we're kicking that can to December. But that could also be a sneaky late addition when you come into the back half of the season. But what I liked mostly was how Frank and Great played together. Like that really seems like a significant dynamic where Great is allowed to go out and shoot. I preferably, and again, I have been a big Great can shoot hype guy. After last night, and from what I heard in the scrimmage against Boise State, maybe let's not take as many shots, or maybe let's start with the mid-range and work our way out, because he was one of
3 from behind the line. So it's not, but the thing with that is one thing that Danny also mentioned in the post-game presser is that because when we went to the media availability that they had a couple of weeks ago, Great wasn't present due to an illness. And that was one of the first things that Danny brought up, said, something that's run through the team. Then some guys still trying to get healthy from it. And that's kind of what it seemed like, is that he's still like, they're still kind of playing it safe, letting him get some time to recover and really get back into game shape. So that's not something I'm necessarily worried about just yet. I see your point, but I think that might be something that you can describe it as is, okay, maybe, he's still getting a feel for it. Maybe he's still a little bit out of it. So that's something that, I want to look at down the road, but I just love the way this team shares the ball, man. And that was something that, especially after the last few years of the Mike Hopkins era, where, you'd look up and the leading assist man had like 4. It felt like way too often. Well, no, I'm just saying the Mike Hopkins era. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But it felt like that happened way too often. But he'd be the only guy with more than like 1 on the team. So that would always be a big part of it as well. But when I look at this team, that was something I really liked. I'm really excited about DJ Davis, Mekhi Mason, Tyler Harris, just this whole cast of characters. It feels like they all fit really, really well together. And that was one of the interesting things about this, where we know he's done this before with having to go get an entirely new group of guys and bring them all together and find a way to make it work. He did it last year at Utah State. So that I'm really excited about. But I also want to get into this December edition that you hinted at, Lars, because it's something that came out a couple of weeks ago through ESPN and Draft Express, that Dominique Diomande, the French the French commit who've been playing overseas for a couple of years professionally, is going to be arriving in December and seeking eligibility. So I'm curious to see how that works out. I don't know if you necessarily have heard anything different from what I have at this point in time, but the more I look at that, the more I say, if this is something that ends up working out, this could just be a real game changer, right as Washington moves into Big Ten play.
This is going to be a callback to yesterday's show. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. It's basically, what I've been told is, it's not a no, it's not a guaranteed slam dunk. Yes. And again, like a talent like Diomande, you're not going to close that door in September, October, November. Once the NCAA closes the door, if they choose to, that's a different story. And really, I think this is, and I can say a little bit about this. This is out of Washington's hands on some regard. This is strictly up to NCAA when it comes to his eligibility. This isn't Washington getting him cleared. This isn't, he could go play at Arkansas with Cal because Cal knows how to sneak guys in. It's no. Danny went and found him. He has the relationship and connection. So if anybody's going to get this kid in the NCAA, it's Danny. But the NCAA might say, well, hey, he's already played professionally. How can we do this? Well, now you have the amateurism out of the window in USA. So my point is, I think it'll all work out in the end, but no one's going to say publicly one way or another until we get to December. So that's why I would say it's out of Washington's hands, but don't think that the door is completely closed. That's what I would say.
So the reason I push back on just the amateurism thing, where it feels like just a slightly different issue, is because we're seeing it with other guys at other programs who are coming in and are eligible to play right away, where it feels like this is more of a particular issue where you're right. It still is out of Washington's hands in that regard. But that's, again, a bridge to cross when you get there, because I look at, especially if Chris Conway's out for an extended period of time, where he's somebody who you really expect to run out the front court. Dominique Diomande can change the whole complexion of this team, where I look at, all right, there's a really nice group of guards, DJ, Mekhi, Zoom Diallo, Luis Courtright, Tyree Inacho, where that's a nice solid core right there. And then there's the bigs. There's obviously the Frank and the KC Ibekwe and Great Osobor and Wilhelm Breidenbach in that mix. But then there's Tyler Harris right now, who just kind of, and Christian King's in that mix as well, where, we saw him shoot the lights out at the Montlick Madness thing. but it feels like he would almost fit more in the guard category with where he is right now. But we look at those two guys in particular and say, all right, they're in the wing bucket right now. And all of a sudden, if you add Dominique Diomande into, because he'd fall into that wing bucket as well, it just changes the whole complexion of the team, because all of a sudden I feel like you can play Tyler Harris at the 4. And I don't want to say get away with that because of, his size and length, he'd be able to play the position really well, but you can put him and Dominique Diomande where that athleticism, the slashing ability that he brings, all of a sudden it just changes everything about the way you can not only defend because of the length and athleticism he brings on that end of the floor as well, but on offense, all of a sudden, this guy can get to the basket. He's scoring 16 a game in France's top professional league. Like, he's a really, really good scorer as well. And he just adds so much to this roster.
Exactly. And I would say don't sleep on Tyree Inacho. Danny said last night he's the fastest guy on the team. So I think that, to me, when I mentioned Diomande and Inacho, and then you add Chris Conway, I got to stop doing that. Chris Conway, it's that's a lethal, that's 3 basically grade A transfers that you're coming in December/January. Those would be massive additions. And when you look at the front court, I was asked last night, what are your thoughts on Casey Becker? I'm like, solid depth. I'm not overly impressed, but I'm not underwhelmed. I think it's a solid depth piece. It's good, to give Frank some minutes. But I think that's why you brought Chris Conway in to be like, hey, we might need another guy in the front court if we want to put Grade at the 5. Because there's so much flexibility with this roster. Right. That's why you don't want starting 5. That's the beautiful thing about it.
So I agree with you there. I think that Casey and Chris Conway were brought in to do very different things. Where Casey is going to be a defensive specialist, a physical guy. Whenever you talk to Frank Kepnang about Casey Ibekwe, or just about anything really, especially the physicality in the Big Ten, he always just says, hey, Casey Ibekwe is going to be right there with us. That's a guy that I'm really excited to have, on this team, be able to not only give me a spell, but a guy who can go in and rebound the basketball and block shots. He's a really, really good defender. Whereas with Chris Conway, I feel like he brings more on the offensive end of the floor. So I'm just curious to see how that works out when this whole team is able to get healthy. And Lars, we're going to have more basketball talk coming up towards the end of the season, because there's just so much more to get around to with just this exciting roster that Danny Sprinkle's got. But until then, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all everydayers for tuning in. And thank you so much for making Locked On Huskies your first listen today. Now for your second listen, check out the Locked On Big Ten podcast. Our guy Craig Sheeman puts the Big Ten first. When everyone else overlooks it, you can find Locked On Big Ten on YouTube or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And with that being said, as always, make sure you subscribe to us as well, wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating the channel with new content every single day. So make sure you hit that like button, click the little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Friday.